The war in Ukraine might be changing gears yet again, with the anticipation of Kyiv's counter-offensive on Moscow. The Ukrainian president and his troops are getting a new weapon in their arsenal. The wish list of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is getting completed by his allies. From getting 31 M1 Abrams tanks from the US on his birthday, to various other arms and ammunition being received throughout the course of war. Ukraine is now getting Storm Shadow long-range missiles from Britain. This is the Storm Shadow missile which you see, which Britain will be providing to Ukraine. Weighing at around 1,300 kilograms, the Storm Shadow missiles are fired from an aircraft. It has a range in excess of 250 kilometers. So with access to long-range missiles, Ukrainian pilots will be able to stay further from the front lines as they prepare for their counter-offensive. Now, UK's Defence Secretary believes the weapons will give Ukraine the best chance of defending itself. As once launched, the Storm Shadow drops to low altitude to avoid detection by enemy radar before latching onto its target with an infrared seeker. Moreover, earlier, Ukraine was receiving missiles that were defensive in nature, in a bid to protect its border from the Russian offensive. But with the Shadow missile being given to Ukraine, Zelensky will have finally a weapon in his arsenal that will be offensive in nature instead. Now, the big question is, will the Storm Shadow missile change the course of the war? If you remember, since the war broke out between the two countries, the war has been fought in and around Ukrainian territory. And with these missiles being included in Ukraine's arsenal, Kyiv will have the capability to target deep inside the Russian territory. Moreover, just a few weeks ago, the drone attack on the Kremlin, which Russia says was a joint effort carried out by the US and Ukraine to assassinate Vladimir Putin. And since the alleged assassination attempt, Moscow has threatened to retaliate when and where it considers necessary. So with Kyiv receiving Storm Shadow long-range missiles, can it become the catalyst in how the war is being fought? And whether the war can spread beyond the borders of Ukraine? All eyes now are on Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who prepares for their counter-offensive against Russian troops. All right, to discuss this further, we have David Dunn, who is a professor of international politics at the University of Birmingham. He's joining us live on the broadcast. Welcome to the show, sir.
Good afternoon.
David, the Storm Shadow, a long-range cruise missile with stealth capabilities. The UK authorities feel this will be a major boost to Ukraine. My question is, can this change the course of the war in Ukraine's favor in terms of how they proceed forward with their offensive?
I think the Storm Shadow and the announcement of the fact that the Ukrainians will have this going forward is a boost both to the morale of Ukraine. It will send fear into the Russian occupying forces in Ukraine, including Crimea, and it will give the capability to the Ukrainians of striking deep into Ukraine, perhaps at the Sevastopol naval base where Russia has its Black Sea fleet, but it will also give the ability to strike command posts, oil depots, railheads, and other important strategic targets. But I'll take exception with what you said in your introduction. This is explicitly not being given to the Ukrainians with the intent of striking inside Russian sovereign territory. The Defense Secretary, Ben Wallace, said this is explicitly for use within Ukrainian sovereign territory. There's been a clear policy on the part of the West, particularly the United States, but also the UK, of only supplying weapons that can strike the occupying forces in Ukraine, and not to give the weapons from the West that could strike into Russia for fear of escalation. So this is a potentially game-changing weapon in support of the Ukrainian counter-offensive, right, but it's not like wanted to lead to escalation.
So the West does not want to escalate it further, but they've still given a weapon in Ukraine's hands which can breach enemy lines and go into enemy territory as well. Let's see what the course of the war changes going forward. My next question to you, sir, the use of a long-range missile can clearly take the war beyond the Ukrainian boundaries, and I'm taking exactly from what you just took exception to. Is it all preparatory for the upcoming counter-offensive?
Yes, the Russians, of course, have declared that Ukraine and the Donbass are now Russian territory. That's disputed by Ukraine. It's disputed by the West, and it's, of course, it's disputed in international law where those boundaries are well established. And the weapon is designed to be used those. But there is an element of trust involved. You're right. There is a risk that Ukraine could misuse those weapons and could use those for escalation. But up till this point, here we are a year and a half, the Ukrainians have only used natively produced or former Soviet systems when they've been attacking Russia. They have not used the weapons supplied for the West. Of course, if they did so, they would know that the West would be inclined to shut off those supplies. And for that reason, the Ukrainians have been very careful only to use their own weapons, only Ukrainian-produced weapons, against Russian territory itself. So I think that the limits of this limited war are fairly well established now, and the Ukrainians are adhering to them. The Russians, by contrast, are using much longer weapons. Ben Wallace talked about the fact that the Russians are using a weapon system with 7 times the range of Storm Shadow. The Caliber and the Killjoy weapons that are long-range hypersonic or cruise missiles Russians have used, are the ones that they're using from deep inside Russia to attack hospitals and schools and civilian houses in Ukraine.
Thank you for joining in on the broadcast, David. That was Professor David Dunn joining in from the University of Birmingham.
Thank you.